Marcus Cole stood at the window of the transport ship and watched Earth grow smaller behind him. And he felt nothing but relief as the blue marble faded into the darkness of space, becoming just another dot among millions of stars that did not care about his failures or his shame or the life he was leaving behind forever. He was 43 years old, and he had lost everything that once made him a man worth knowing. And now he was running away to the edge of known space, because he could not bear to stay on a world where everyone knew his name for all the wrong reasons. The divorce had come first, then the bankruptcy, then the lawsuits that dragged his reputation through the courts until there was nothing left of the person he used to be. And when the Galactic Frontier Commission announced their program for humans, willing to claim abandoned alien structures on distant worlds, Marcus had signed up before he could change his mind. They called it the Reclamation Initiative, and it was designed for people exactly like him. People with nothing to lose and nowhere else to go. People desperate enough to travel to the far edges of mapped space and live alone in structures built by species that have vanished centuries ago. His destination was a place called Callus 7. A world of perpetual twilight where the sun never fully rose and never fully set. And on this forgotten rock sat an outpost that had been empty for 300 years, abandoned by a species called the Vethrani for reasons that nobody in the Galactic Confederacy would explain. The other aliens had warned him not to go there, and the Confederacy officials had tried to redirect him to safer locations. But Marcus did not want safe, because safe meant people, and people meant questions, and questions meant having to explain why a man his age was running away from his own planet. He wanted to be alone, and Callus 7 promised exactly that. The journey took 4 months in the cramped transport ship, and Marcus spent most of that time sleeping or staring at the stars or reading the sparse files about his new home. And the files told him almost nothing useful except that the Vethrani had been a tall and elegant species known for their art and their philosophy, and their sudden withdrawal from galactic affairs 3 centuries ago. Nobody knew why they had left or where they had gone, and nobody seemed to want to find out. And that mystery should have worried Marcus more than it did. But he was too tired to care about alien secrets when he had so many of his own. When the ship finally dropped out of faster than light, travel in Callus 7 appeared on the view screen. Marcus felt his breath catch in his throat, because the planet was beautiful in a haunting and lonely way. All purple plains and silver mountains and skies painted in shades of orange and red that never changed. His shuttle descended through the thin atmosphere and kicked up clouds of violet dust as it touched down on the rocky ground. And through the window, Marcus could see the outpost rising from the plains like nothing he had ever imagined. It was a black cathedral of spiraling towers and curved walls, elegant and impossible and clearly not built by human hands. And it stretched toward the dim sky as if reaching for something that was no longer there. And Marcus sat in his shuttle for a long time, just staring at the structure that would be his home for the rest of his life. He gathered his supplies and stepped out onto the surface of Callus 7. And the air was thin but breathable, and the gravity was lighter than Earth, and the silence was so complete that he could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. The walk to the outpost took 20 minutes, and with every step the structure grew larger and more intimidating. And by the time Marcus reached the main entrance, he felt like an ant approaching a monument built for giants, which he supposed was not far from the truth. The doors were twice his height and made of some dark metal that did not exist on Earth, and Marcus expected them to be locked or sealed or impossible to open. But when he pressed his palm against the surface, they slid apart with a soft hiss, as if they had been waiting for him inside. The air was stale but clean, and emergency lights flickered to life as he walked through the entrance hall. illuminating walls covered in patterns and symbols that meant nothing to him. And the furniture was sized for beings much taller than any human. And dust covered every surface like a gray blanket that had been undisturbed for centuries. Marcus explored the outpost for hours, moving through chambers and corridors and halls that seemed to go on forever. And he found living quarters and storage rooms in what might have been a kitchen and what might have been a library. And all of it was empty and silent and waiting. He should have felt scared or at least unsettled, but instead, he felt a strange sense of peace, because this place asked nothing of him and expected nothing from him and did not know or care about the man he used to be. On his third day in the outpost, Marcus found a door that was different from all the others. A door at the end of a long corridor in the deepest part of the structure. And this door was sealed with locks and mechanisms that looked far more serious than anything else he had encountered. The files had mentioned this door, and they had mentioned that every salvage team and exploration party that had visited the outpost over the centuries had failed to open it. And Marcus did not expect to succeed where so many others had failed, but when he placed his hand against the cold metal surface, something happened that changed everything. The locks clicked, and the mechanisms whirred, and the door slid open as if it had been designed for his touch alone. And Marcus stood frozen in shock as lights flickered to life in the chamber beyond, revealing a room that had been sealed since before humanity learned to make fire in. The center of the room sat a pedestal made of the same dark metal as the rest of the outpost. And on that pedestal rested a sphere of crystal about the size of a human head. And the sphere was pulsing with a soft blue light that seemed to breathe in and out like something alive. Marcus walked toward it slowly, his heart racing, his mind trying to make sense of what he was seeing. And when he stood before the pedestal, the light in the sphere grew brighter and warmer, and he heard a voice speak directly into his mind. Marcus Cole, the voice said, and it was neither male nor female, but something ancient and patient and kind. I have been waiting for you for a very long time. And now that you are here, everything can finally begin. He wanted to run, and he wanted to scream, and he wanted to demand answers. But instead, Marcus just stood there staring at the glowing sphere. And he knew in that moment that his plan to disappear and be forgotten had failed completely, because something on this abandoned outpost had been expecting him. And whatever came next would be bigger than anything he had ever imagined. Marcus stood before the glowing sphere for what felt like hours, his mind racing with questions he did not know how to ask. And the blue light continued to pulse gently, as if waiting for him to find his voice again. What are you? He finally managed to say, and his words came out as a whisper that echoed in the sealed chamber. The voice returned to his mind, warm and patient, like a teacher speaking to a confused student. And it said, I am called the Warden, and I am the last guardian of this place. And I have waited 300 of your years for a human to finally arrive. Marcus shook his head because none of this made sense to him. And he said, that is impossible because humans only made contact with the Confederacy 50 years ago. And nobody knew we existed before that. So how could you be waiting for us? The Warden's light flickered in what might have been amusement. And then the chamber around Marcus transformed as holographic images appeared in the air, showing stars and galaxies and timelines that stretched back millions of years into the past. Let me show you the truth, the Warden said, and let me tell you the story that the Vethrani discovered in this very room. The story that broke them and sent them fleeing into isolation and despair. The images shifted and Marcus saw a civilization unlike anything he had ever imagined. Beings of light and energy who built structures that spanned solar systems and who seeded life across 1,000 worlds with the patience of gods, who had eternity to work. With these were the architects, the Warden explained. and they were the first intelligent species to rise in this galaxy. And they spent millions of years nurturing life and guiding evolution and building wonders that still exist today in places that have been forgotten. Marcus watched in awe as the architects created the foundations of what would become the Galactic Confederacy, planting the seeds of species that would not develop consciousness for millions of years. And he felt small in a way that had nothing to do with his personal failures. What happened to them? He asked. The holographic images grew darker, and the warden's voice became heavy with something that sounded like grief. And the answer came in images of shadow and destruction that made Marcus feel cold despite the warmth of the chamber. A darkness came from the void between galaxies. The warden said, a presence that feeds on despair and grows stronger with every mind that falls into hopelessness. And it swept through the galaxy like a plague of the soul. And the architects, with all their power and wisdom, could not defeat it. Marcus saw the great civilization crumble as the darkness spread, watched as beings of immense intelligence simply gave up and faded away. And he understood that the enemy was not a physical thing but something far worse. The architects were too advanced. The warden continued, too connected to the cosmic truth that all things end. And that knowledge made them vulnerable because they could not believe in hope when they understood the mathematics of entropy. The images showed the last of the architects making a desperate choice, sealing away their technology and their weapons and their knowledge in hidden places across the galaxy, preparing for a future they would never see. But before they faded, they did one final thing, the warden said. And the holographic display changed to show a small blue planet orbiting an ordinary yellow star. They engineered a species designed to survive what they could not. A species built to feel hope even when hope was irrational. A species capable of spite and stubbornness and the refusal to surrender, even when surrender was the logical choice. Marcus stared at the image of Earth, and his throat went dry as he understood what the warden was telling him. Humans, he whispered. Yes, the warden confirmed. Your species was designed as a backup, a failsafe, a last hope planted in the soil of a forgotten world and left to grow wild and strong and stubborn. And the architects knew that if the darkness ever returned, it would find you waiting. Marcus laughed because the idea was absurd. And he said, we are not special, we are just people. We fight and fail and give up all the time. I am proof of that, because I came here to run away from my own life. The warden's light pulsed with something like compassion. And it said, you came here because you were hurt and tired and lost, but you did not give up, Marcus Cole. Because giving up would have meant staying on Earth and accepting that your story was over. And instead, you traveled across the galaxy to start again. That is not the same thing, Marcus argued. It is exactly the same thing, the warden replied. And it is why the Vethrani could not bear what they learned in this chamber. Because they discovered that they were not the chosen ones, that they were not special, that a young and primitive species from a forgotten corner of the galaxy had been designed to save everyone while they could only watch and wait. The images showed the Vethrani finding this same room 3 centuries ago, showed them learning the same truth that Marcus was learning now, and showed them breaking under the weight of knowledge that crushed their pride and their purpose. They sealed this chamber and fled, the warden said. And they withdrew from galactic affairs because they could not accept that the future belonged to humanity. And they have been hiding ever since, waiting for an end they believe is inevitable. Marcus felt anger rising in his chest. And he said, why would they hide instead of warning everyone? Why would they keep this secret and let the galaxy remain unprepared? Because they had already lost hope, the warden answered. And that is precisely why the architects did not choose them. Because hope is not a feeling that comes from knowing you will win. It is a choice you make when everything says you should lose. The chamber fell silent as Marcus processed everything he had been told. and he wanted to reject it all as fantasy or madness. But something deep inside him recognized the truth in the warden's words. The darkness is coming back, is it not? He asked quietly. Yes, the warden confirmed. Within a single human generation, it will return. And when it does, it will find a galaxy full of species who have forgotten how to hope. And they will fall just as the architects fell, unless someone teaches them to stand. Marcus thought of his daughter Sarah back on Earth. The daughter he had not spoken to in 3 years. The daughter who would inherit a galaxy on the brink of extinction if he did nothing. Why me? He asked, and his voice cracked with the weight of what was being placed on his shoulders. Because you are here, the warden said simply. And because you are human, and because sometimes the universe does not choose heroes. It simply waits for someone broken enough to have nothing left to lose and stubborn enough to fight anyway. Marcus looked at the glowing sphere and knew that his life of quiet isolation had just ended before it began. And he made a choice that surprised even himself. Show me everything, he said. Show me what the architects left behind, and show me how to use it. Because if the darkness is coming for my daughter, then I will be ready to meet it. The warden's light blazed bright with something that felt like joy. And the walls of the outpost began to shift and change around them as systems that had slept for millions of years finally woke up. Then let us begin, the warden said, because we have much work to do and not much time to do it. The outpost transformed around Marcus over the following weeks, and walls that had been solid stone revealed hidden doorways, and floors that had been bare metal opened into chambers filled with technology that made human science look like children playing with toys. Warden guided him through every room and every system, explaining machines that could fold space like paper and weapons that could crack moons with a single shot and shields that could protect entire planets from the death of stars. And Marcus absorbed it all with a hunger that surprised him. He had been an engineer before his life fell apart. A builder of bridges and structures that people used every day without thinking about the person who designed them. And now he was learning to understand engineering on a scale that his old professors would have called impossible. But the more he learned, the more he understood that one man could not do what needed to be done. And the warden confirmed this during one of their long conversations in the central chamber. The architects designed their technology to respond to human DNA, the warden explained. And you are the key that unlocked this place. But you cannot operate the fleet alone. You cannot man the weapons alone. You cannot fight a war against cosmic darkness with only 2 hands. Marcus had been thinking about this problem for days. And he said, the Confederacy will not believe me if I tell them what is coming. They already think humans are primitive newcomers who got lucky finding a seat at the galactic table. That is correct, the warden agreed. And even if they believed you, they could not help because their technology cannot interface with what the architects left behind. Only human hands can activate these systems. Only human minds can control these ships. Then I need more humans, Marcus said. And the idea that had been forming in his mind finally took shape. But not the ones who have comfortable lives and everything to lose. I need the ones like me. The warden's light flickered with curiosity, and it asked, what do you mean? Marcus walked to the communication array that they had activated the day before, and he began composing a message that would travel across the galaxy to human space. I was not the only person who signed up for the Reclamation Initiative, he explained as he worked. There were thousands of us, maybe tens of thousands, all people who had lost everything and were looking for a second chance on the edges of known space. He thought about the faces he had seen at the processing center, back on Earth. The tired eyes and the slumped shoulders and the quiet desperation of people who had run out of options. And he knew that those were the people he needed. I'm going to offer them something better than an empty alien ruin to hide in, Marcus said. I am going to offer them a purpose. The message went out that night. transmitted through channels that the Confederacy did not monitor, reaching humans scattered across the frontier on abandoned stations and forgotten outposts and ships that barely held together. Marcus did not promise them safety or comfort or easy lives. He promised them the truth about what was coming and the chance to be part of something bigger than their own broken stories. And he waited to see if anyone would answer. The first ship arrived 2 weeks later, a cargo shuttle held together with patches and prayers. And Marcus met the pilot at the landing zone as she climbed down from the cockpit with suspicious eyes and a hand resting on the weapon. At her hip, her name was Elena Vasquez, and she had been a military pilot before a wrongful court-martial ended her career. And she looked at Marcus like she expected this to be some kind of trap. "Your message said you had something important to show people," she said. "And I came a long way to see if you were telling the truth or just crazy." Marcus smiled for the first time in months and said, "Probably both. But come inside and let me show you anyway." He showed her everything. The technology and the weapons and the history of the architects and the darkness that was coming. And Elena listened without interrupting until he finished. "So you are telling me that humans were designed to save the galaxy," she said slowly, "and that all this alien technology only works for us, and that some kind of space monster is coming to eat everyone's hope. That is a simple way to put it, but yes." Marcus agreed. Elena was quiet for a long moment. And then she laughed in a way that sounded more like relief than humor. "Good," she said, "because I was really tired of feeling useless. And fighting cosmic evil sounds better than hauling cargo for people who think I am a criminal." More ships came after that, one by one and then in small groups. Humans from every corner of settled space who had received the message and decided to take a chance on the crazy man living in the Vethrani outpost. They were criminals and exiles and veterans and survivors. People who had been thrown away by a society that did not know what to do with its broken pieces. And they arrived expecting nothing and found a place where they finally mattered. Marcus organized them into teams and set them to work learning the architect technology. And some of them trained as pilots, and some as engineers, and some as soldiers. And the outpost that had been empty for 300 years began to feel alive again. The Confederacy noticed eventually, because it was impossible to hide. Thousands of humans gathering on a forgotten world. And they sent representatives to demand explanations. Marcus met the Confederacy delegation in the main hall and told them a version of the truth that he knew they would not believe. And he was right, because the alien diplomats looked at him like he was a child telling stories about monsters under the bed. The Vethrani abandoned this place because of mental illness, the lead diplomat said with barely hidden contempt. And now humans are gathering here to play with technology you do not understand. This is dangerous and irresponsible. Then leave us alone and let us be dangerous and irresponsible on our own. Marcus replied calmly, "Because we are not asking for help or permission. We are just telling you what is coming, so you cannot say we did not warn you." The delegation left angry and confused. And Marcus knew they would be back with threats and demands. But he also knew they were already too late to stop what he had started. The human fleet grew larger every month as more ships arrived and more systems came online in the outpost. And Marcus watched his collection of broken people transform into something that looked almost like an army. Elena became his second in command, and she brought military discipline to the chaos. And a man named James, who had been a scientist before his funding was cut, figured out how to interface the architect weapons with human targeting systems. And a woman named Yuki, who had lost her family in a colony disaster, became the best pilot any of them had ever seen. They trained and they built and they prepared. And Marcus led them not because he was the strongest or the smartest, but because he had been the first and because he believed in them. When they had forgotten how to believe in themselves at night, Marcus sometimes stood alone on the observation deck and watched the stars. And he thought about his daughter Sarah and wondered if she knew what her father was doing on the edge of the galaxy. He had sent her messages but received no replies. And he did not blame her, because he had not been a good father even before everything fell apart. But he hoped that someday she would understand why he had to do this. The darkness was coming, and he could feel it in his bones like a storm building on the horizon. And when it arrived, he would be ready, not because he was special or chosen or destined for greatness, but because he was stubborn and angry and tired of watching people give up, and because somewhere in the galaxy his daughter was living her life without knowing what was coming for her. And Marcus would burn the universe down before he let anything hurt her. "We are running out of time," the warden said one night as they reviewed the fleet's progress. Marcus nodded and looked at the star maps showing the void between galaxies, the empty space where something ancient and hungry was beginning to stir. "Then we better work faster," he said. And he went back to preparing for a war that nobody else believed was coming. The day the darkness returned began like any other day on Kella 7, with Marcus reviewing fleet readiness reports and Elena running combat drills, and the 10,000 humans who now called the Outpost home preparing for a battle that many still thought would never come. Then the alarms started screaming. The warden's voice cut through the chaos with words that Marcus had been dreading for 3 years. And it said, "Contact detected at the edge of the galaxy. Multiple signatures emerging from the void. The darkness has returned." Marcus ran to the command center where holographic displays showed the galactic map. And he watched in cold horror as shadows began spreading across the stars like ink dropped in water. And each shadow represented a tendril of the enemy reaching toward inhabited worlds. "How long before they reach Confederacy space?" he demanded. 6 hours, the warden replied. "And they are broadcasting the signal." The signal was something the architects had warned about in their records, a frequency that resonated with the deepest fears of intelligent minds and overwhelmed them with despair so complete that it simply turned off the will to live. Marcus had listened to recordings of the signal and felt nothing but irritation like static on old radio. And he had confirmed that every human in the outpost experienced the same immunity. But now he needed to know if the Confederacy could withstand what was coming. They could not. Reports started flooding in from across the galaxy as the darkness spread. And each report was worse than the last. Entire space stations went silent as their crews stopped responding to communications. And colony worlds reported populations that had simply stopped moving. People frozen in place with expressions of hopeless terror on their faces. And military fleets drifted dead in space as their alien crews surrendered to the despair without firing a single shot. The Galactic Confederacy that had looked down on humans as primitive newcomers was collapsing in real time. And the politicians and diplomats who had dismissed Marcus as a madman were now among the billions falling into darkness. "We need to move now," Elena said at his side. And her voice was steady, despite the horror unfolding on the displays. Marcus nodded and opened a channel to the entire fleet. And he said, "This is Marcus Cole. The moment we have been preparing for has arrived. Launch all ships and form up on these coordinates. We are going to war." The human fleet rose from Kella 7 like a swarm of angry fireflies. 300 ships crewed by people who had once been considered worthless by the societies that produced them, armed with weapons that had not fired in a million years, and heading toward an enemy that had destroyed civilizations before humans learned to walk upright as they flew toward the front lines. Marcus received a message from the Confederacy Council, and for the first time the alien leaders sounded terrified instead of contemptuous. "Human fleet, we are requesting immediate assistance," the message said. Our defenses have failed and our populations are incapacitated. Please help us." Marcus thought about how they had laughed at his warnings and how they had threatened to blockade Kellis 7 and how they had called humans too young and too primitive to understand galactic affairs. And he thought about ignoring their call and letting them face the consequences of their arrogance. But then he thought about all the innocent people on those worlds who had never laughed at anyone. The children and the workers and the ordinary beings who were suffering because their leaders had been too proud to listen. And he knew what he had to do. "All ships, new orders," he said, over the fleet channel. "We are not just here to fight. We are here to save everyone we can. Break into squadrons and head for the nearest populated systems. Protect the civilians and do not let the darkness take a single world without a fight." The fleet scattered across the galaxy like seeds thrown into the wind. And Marcus led his command group toward the heart of the Confederacy, where the largest populations were already falling silent. They arrived at a world called Tessara Prime to find a nightmare. Planet below was home to 12 billion beings of Apollon cells, species called the Tessari, gentle creatures known for their art and their music and their complete inability to comprehend violence. And every single one of them had stopped moving. The darkness hung in space above the world like a cloud of living shadow, pulsing and shifting and broadcasting its signal of despair. And Marcus felt his ship shudder as the frequency washed over them inside. The ship, nothing happened except a faint buzz in the communication systems. And Marcus looked at his crew and saw humans annoyed by the noise, but otherwise unaffected. "Target the largest concentration of shadow," he ordered, "and show these things what human spite feels like." The architect weapons fired for the first time in a million years. Beams of light that burned like captured stars. And where they struck the darkness, it screamed. Marcus had not expected the enemy to have a voice, but it did. A sound that echoed through space and through minds. A howl of shock and pain from something that had never encountered resistance before. "It is working," Elena shouted from her station. "The darkness is retreating from the impact points." "Then keep firing," Marcus ordered. "And get our ground teams ready, because we need to wake up those people before the shadows come back." Human soldiers landed on Tessara Prime and walked among the frozen population. And they played music through loudspeakers and shouted words of encouragement and physically shook the Tessari, who stood like statues in their streets and homes. At first, nothing happened, and Marcus began to fear that the damage was permanent. But then one Tessari blinked and looked around with confusion in its eyes, and then another and another. And soon thousands of them were waking from the nightmare as the human presence somehow broke through the despair. "How is this possible?" Elena asked as she watched the feeds from the surface. Marcus understood, and he said, "The architects designed us to feel hope even when it is irrational, and hope is contagious. Just standing near us is enough to remind them that giving up is a choice and they can choose differently." The battle for Tessara Prime lasted 6 hours. And by the end, the darkness had retreated to the edges of the system, and the population was shaken but alive. And Marcus received a message from the Tessari leader that consisted of only 2 words: "Thank you." But there was no time to rest, because there were thousands of worlds under attack and only 300 human ships to defend them. And Marcus knew that they could not win by fighting alone. "We need to teach them," he said to his officers as they planned their next move. "We need to show the Confederacy how to fight back, how to feel hope instead of despair, how to stand up when everything tells them to stay down. Can we do that?" James asked with doubt in his voice. Marcus looked at his crew, at Elena and James and Yuki and all the others who had been broken and discarded and forgotten. And he saw people who had learned to hope again because someone gave them a reason to try. "We already did it once," he said, "with each other. Now we just have to do it with everyone else." The human fleet spread across the galaxy, not as conquerors, but as teachers. And everywhere they went, they fought the darkness with weapons and with words, showing species who had surrendered to despair that surrender was not the only option. The war had begun. And for the first time in millions of years, the darkness had found something it did not understand: humans who refused to give up. A galaxy that was slowly learning to refuse alongside them. The war lasted 3 years, and it cost more than Marcus could have ever imagined. He lost friends in battles that raged across star systems, watched ships crewed by people he had trained disappear in flashes of light, held the hands of dying soldiers who thanked him with their last breaths for giving them something worth dying for. Elena fell in the defense of a refugee convoy, a ship ramming a mass of darkness to buy time for the civilians to escape. And Marcus had not cried in decades, but he wept for her that night alone in his quarters. James died when a research station was overrun, staying behind to transmit crucial data about the enemy's weakness while the shadows consumed him. And Yuki was badly wounded in a battle that saved 3 worlds, but left her unable to fly again. Human fleet that had started with 300 ships grew to 3,000 as more humans answered the call. Ordinary people who saw the news feeds of their species fighting cosmic darkness and decided they wanted to be part of something bigger than themselves. And slowly, impossibly, they began to win, not because they had better weapons, though the architect technology gave them an edge, and not because they were stronger or smarter than the species who had fallen before them, but because they refused to accept that losing was inevitable. The darkness fed on despair and grew stronger when being surrendered to hopelessness. But it had never encountered a species that could look at certain death and feel anger instead of fear, that could watch friends die and choose revenge instead of grief, that could lose everything and still find a reason to keep fighting. Humans were not immune to pain or loss or suffering, but they had something the darkness could not understand. They had spite. Marcus led a strike force into the heart of the enemy's territory, a region of space so saturated with shadow that sensors could not penetrate and communications could not escape. And he took only volunteers because he knew that many of them would not come back. "Why are you doing this?" the warden asked as they prepared to depart. Marcus thought about the question and about everything that had happened since he came to Kawa 7 as a broken man looking for a place to hide. And he said, "Because someone has to, and because I am tired of watching other people sacrifice while I stay safe." The strike force punched through the outer layers of darkness and fought their way toward the center, losing ships at every step, but never slowing down. And Marcus felt the enemy's signal growing stronger with every kilometer they advanced. It whispered to him of failure and loss, reminded him of his divorce and his bankruptcy, and his daughter who still had not answered his messages, told him that everything he had built would crumble, just like everything else in his life. And Marcus listened to all of it and said, "I know, but I am going to keep fighting anyway." At the center of the darkness they found something that the architects had described in their oldest records, a core of pure despair that was the source of everything, a wound in reality where hope could not exist. The warden had given Marcus a weapon for this moment, a device that the architects had designed, but never used because they could not believe it would work. And as his ship approached the core, Marcus activated it. The weapon did not fire energy or projectiles. It broadcast a message. The message was simple, just a collection of human voices saying words that the darkness could not comprehend. Words like, "Get up and keep going," and "It is not over, and you are not alone." Millions of humans across the galaxy had recorded their voices for this moment, speaking encouragement to beings they would never meet, offering hope to a universe that had forgotten what hope felt like. The darkness recoiled from the message like a creature touching fire, and for the first time, Marcus heard it speak in something other than screams of rage. "Why do you not surrender?" it asked with something that sounded almost like confusion. Marcus stood on the bridge of his battered ship with wounds on his body, and grief in his heart, and exhaustion in his bones. And he looked at the enemy that had destroyed civilizations and consumed stars and ended the architects themselves. Because humans are stubborn, he said, and because giving up would mean letting you win. And I would rather die fighting than live knowing I quit. You will die anyway. The darkness said, all things end, all light fades, all hope is temporary. Maybe, Marcus agreed, but not today, and not because you decided it. He pushed the weapon to its maximum output, and the message of hope flooded through the core of darkness. And across the galaxy, every being who had been touched by the enemy felt something stir in their hearts. Confederacy species who had learned to fight again rose up with new determination, and the human ships that had been scattered across the skies. 1,000 battlefields felt strength return to their weary crews. And the tide of the war shifted in a single moment. The darkness began to starve. Without despair to feed on, it grew weaker. And without hopelessness to spread, it could not replace what it lost. And slowly it began to retreat toward the void between galaxies where it had slept for millions of years. Marcus watched it go from the observation deck of his flagship. His body broken and his fleet decimated, but his spirit undefeated, and he felt no triumph or joy. Only a tired satisfaction that the job was done. The architects would be proud. The warden said quietly in his mind. Marcus shook his head and said, they hoped this would work. But they could not know for sure. Nobody can know if hope will be enough until they try. A message arrived as the last tendrils of darkness faded from Confederacy space. And when Marcus saw the sender, his heart stopped. It was from his daughter, Sarah. Dad, the message said, I saw what you did on the news feeds. I saw you leading the fleet and saving all those worlds. And I do not understand how any of this is possible, but I am proud of you. I am so proud of you. Please come home. Marcus read the message 3 times and felt tears running down his face. And he thought about how he had come to Cali 7 as a failure, looking for a place to disappear. He had found something else instead. The Galactic Confederacy declared a day of celebration in honor of humanity and species that had once looked down on humans as primitive newcomers now spoke their name with respect and gratitude. But Marcus did not attend the celebrations because he had somewhere more important to be. He landed his shuttle on Earth for the first time in 7 years and walked 2 streets that felt smaller than he remembered. And he found Sarah waiting for him at the door of her apartment with her mother's eyes and her father's stubborn jaw. You look terrible, she said with a smile that held no anger. I feel terrible, Marcus admitted, but I had to come. I had to see you. I had to tell you that everything I did was because I wanted you to have a future worth living. Sarah hugged him, and Marcus held his daughter for the first time since before everything fell apart. And he understood that this was what hope felt like. Not the absence of pain or loss or failure, but the choice to keep reaching for something good, despite all of it. The war was over, and the darkness was gone. But the galaxy had been changed forever. Humans were no longer the primitive newcomers at the bottom of the Confederacy. They were the species that had taught everyone else how to hope. The stubborn and spiteful and impossibly determined people who had looked at cosmic extinction and said, not today. And on a forgotten outpost on Cali 7, the warden's light pulsed with satisfaction as it recorded the final chapter of a story that had begun millions of years ago with the architects, planting seeds of hope on a small blue world. The seeds had grown into something the universe had never seen before. Humans who refused to give up, and a galaxy that had learned to refuse alongside them.